Good evening. Welcome to the Allen Public Library. We have an outstanding speaker tonight. I took a course in frontier history in college, and the professor began the first course by saying, Western history can be determined and studied down the barrel of a shotgun. So that got my attention. Nevertheless, John Lane, our speaker tonight, has written 2 books. One is Gunslingers, The Story of the Old West, and Red River Reunion. Tonight we have John Lane.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here tonight. As I told you in our pre-production meeting, our conversation, that a couple, about two and a half years ago, I was in this very auditorium with a notebook and a pen in my hand, and I was listening to an author doing a presentation on his book. And I thought at that time my first book, Gunslingers, the first edition of Gunslingers, hadn't been released yet, and I was preparing for that release and the subsequent tour that I knew, or that I at least hoped that I was going to embark on. And I thought to myself, the way the production went and with the audience and the entire facility, I just thought it would really be something someday if I could make my way up onto that stage and be the one presenting. And here I am today. So this really is a dream come true for me. And I thank you and the City of Allen and the Allen Public Library for giving me that opportunity. I'll start out with a little bit of history about myself. I did not start out as a book author. About 40 years ago, to be exact 40 years ago, I joined the Houston Police Department, and I was a law enforcement officer, and still am a law enforcement officer from 1981 until current day. I've retired once and was convinced to stay in the business, and I'm currently a senior detective for the University of Texas System Police, and I'm assigned over in Arlington at the UT Arlington. So I'm proud to represent that group of men and women in that profession, and I call out to a lot of them tonight. I know that many of them are watching, and I really appreciate their support. My writing career actually began in a different genre. I didn't start out writing Westerns, although Westerns are a major passion of mine, probably more of a passion now than the sporting world. And that's where I started out. Along the way, I've been a baseball coach at the high school level, the collegiate level. I've coached players that from high school that went on to college and into professional baseball. The same thing with some of my college players. And I'm very proud of that. And I started out my writing career, my professional writing career, as a sports editor and for an online magazine, and actually writing independent articles for national magazines. So that's really where I started writing for not a living, but writing for professional purposes and starting to attempt anyway to hone my skills. And about 7 years ago, it's in a relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of things, I was pontificating one evening about the fact that I really wanted to get into to write a book. I felt that I had the discipline and the knowledge, and I certainly had the passion, and I wanted to get started, but I really wasn't sure how to do it. I didn't have any author friends. I had some connections in my sports writing community that was with me, but nobody that really could start telling me, well, this is how you need to do it. So I decided, with some serious encouragement from my spouse, she finally told me she was tired of listening to me talk about it, and she wanted me to do something about it. And I decided she was right, and I took a course, a community continuing education course right here in Collin College, and it was titled The 10 Things Every Writer Should Know. And it was basically the introduction to writing novels. And I couldn't have been more pleased with that particular course. And the individual that was instructing it was a well-known Dallas author, Brian W. Smith is his name. And he did a fantastic job and was a big influence on me. And actually, one of the assignments, the primary assignment at the end of this course, was to write about 1,500-word chapter of a book. Just start writing and come up with the concept of what you wanted to write about and so forth, and put the things that we had learned in the previous 6 or 8 weeks to work in this piece, in this written piece. And that actually turned out to be chapter 1 of Gunslingers. I wrote that 1,500 words, and of course it was rewritten a number of times, but basically that assignment became chapter 1 of Gunslingers. And once I started into that, it really just, it took off, and I really couldn't stop writing. I wrote every waking hour that I could, and there were times even when I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about a scene, and I would get up and I would make notes and write a paragraph and so forth. So, and no complaints. I absolutely loved it. I love it today, and I can't wait for the moment, the day that I can write full-time and commit all of my energy and passion to writing additional books. Such as Gunslingers and my second book, Red River Reunion. So that's really kind of how I started with regard to the professional writing career, like I say, and then what got me started taking a college class. Even though it was continuing ed, and I was an old guy at that time, it didn't matter. I love learning, and I soaked everything up that was in that course. And it's gotten me here today in front of all of you. So I'm really, really appreciative of that. The type of writer that I am, before I get into Gunslingers, and a lot of this presentation is basically a result of individuals that have been asking me questions or wanting me to comment on certain things over the past few years when I've been on tour and I've had the opportunity to make a number of appearances. Despite the 2020 that we all experienced last year with a lot of the restrictions and such, I was still able to eventually get back out and make some appearances. Restricted though they were, I was able to get out there and talk with some folks, and we negotiated through the masks and everything, and so a lot of the information that I give you is really a result of some of those conversations. And one of the main questions that I'm asked is, well, what kind of a writer are you? And that really comes down in the author world. That really comes down to two things. Do you write very specifically, or are you sort of a freewheeling writer? In other words, does the story write itself? And that's called a pantster. Writing by the seat of your pants. It's just kind of it's not an official word, I don't think, but it's kind of a cute word that describes some of us writers that write in that manner. And that's exactly how I write. Now, I'm a very linear type of individual. You know my background now in law enforcement. It's kind of rigid. It's very disciplined and so forth, at least in my career. That's how I've been. So I'm a very linear type of individual, and I know that the audience out there that's live tonight watching, I can hear several of you laughing, and I can see you nodding your head. Those of you that know me. So I also write in a very linear manner. In other words, I start with chapter 1, I go to chapter 2, and then I move on through the book. Many writers don't do that, and I actually tried a method. It's called the bubble method. I called it the shotgun method. Again, more to my genre, where you start writing just different scenes and different things, and then you put it all together at a later time. and I did not like that at all. That didn't fit with my personality. It did not work well with how I like to keep things organized. So I pushed that method aside, and I decided that I needed to do things my way, and it's very linear. But that said, it is a creative process. This is fiction, although the books are historically factual, and I'll get into that a little bit later on when Tom and I are talking and such. But the story more or less comes to me as I'm writing. I do have a character in mind most of the time, but not all the time. And later on, I'll talk about one of the primary characters in my books. He starts out as an ex-Texas Ranger. He eventually becomes another Texas Ranger later on in the stories, but he never existed in my first book. He actually showed up one day when I was writing the chapter that he actually appears in. And those of you that have read Gunslingers, hopefully you'll remember his entry into the story, his introduction, really. It's rather dramatic, and it's rather loud, and he wasn't in my mind when I sat down and started writing that chapter. I never knew Wes Payne was going to exist in Gunslingers. And by the end of the chapter, he became such a prominent character in my mind that I decided I have to keep this guy around because I like him too much. And, you know, authors will tell you, writers will tell you, don't get too connected to your characters if you can help it, because that might stunt the growth of the character, or it will limit you in some of the things that you can do with that character later on. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think Wes is growing as we move along through what is now a series, and I think those of you that have read both books will see that in both my primary character, Luxton Danner. He's a U.S. Deputy Marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and then Wes, who is just kind of a floater right there. He's kind of a gunslinger floater. Not so much a man with no name, but he has a little bit of a past that you can find out a little bit more about if you check my website, because there are, under the blog section, there are short stories that tell you the backstory of Wes Payne and Luxton Danner. So a little bit of a plug there for you. Okay, so we'll move off of that. Here's some of the information. I don't think you can read all of that there, but some of this I've already told you about with regard to my professional past and how I started out as a professional writer, and why am I writing Westerns, because it's a passion of mine. I grew up on the Western genre. I'm very, very thankful and fortunate that both my mother and father enjoyed that genre dramatically, and they instilled that upon me, and I really, really enjoy it. I'm just old enough to remember all of the old television shows and so forth that were part of Saturday and Sunday afternoon. In my house on Saturday afternoon, you watched the Saturday afternoon Western movie. You didn't watch college football like everybody seems to now, during the season anyway. Same thing on Sundays. Oftentimes the Sunday afternoon movie would be the Western genre, and we were tuned into that on the one television we had in our house. So whatever my parents decided they were watching, that's what we watched also. But this panel will tell you that some of my writing influence comes from a contemporary writer right now, a very popular Western. He's contemporary Western, C.J. Box. Those of you that watch a little television and are very interested in contemporary Western, you're going to know Mr. Box's name. He's very much an influence in my writing. Lee Child is also an influence, primarily because I've read so many of his Jack Reacher books, and I enjoy the way he developed that character. And also the really Louis L'Amour and Robert B. Parker are the two main Western genre authors that I've read a great deal of and really, really enjoy. And then you also see up there, if you can, it'll tell you some of the live action or movie and television actors and directors that influenced me a great deal. And it's no surprise that you'll find John Wayne up there. You'll find James Stewart up there, along with Clint Eastwood a little bit after those fellas. And directors, John Ford, he goes all the way back to silent films. He directed a number of John Wayne films. They had some real success, along with Andrew McLaughlin and Henry Hathaway and some of those fellas. So that gives you a little bit more about me and about my influences and what really has brought me to this point in my writing career. Okay, book one, Gunslingers, A Story of the Old West. Now, book one here that you see is actually the second edition. Already I have a second edition out. The first edition of Gunslingers was with a publishing house that I am no longer with. That was my first publishing house, which I'm very grateful to. They gave me my start and such. But the first edition of Gunslingers, when I read through it, I thought that, and this happens to a lot of us in the entertainment business. We see our work and we decide it's not good enough or we can do better. And I felt that I was a little bit or a lot better writer than I was when I first started that first edition of Gunslingers. So I had some great feedback. It had 5-star reviews. I was very, very pleased with the reception that I got on it. But as soon as I was able to get the rights back to Gunslingers, which I had to wait 2 years, I had a new publisher and agent and such, and I had already made the decision that I was going to go back, re-edit and enhance Gunslingers so that I would put out a better product for my fans. And that's what you see there, Gunslingers, A Story of the Old West. And the elevator speech on this book really is kind of interesting. It follows a U.S. Deputy Marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and a Texas Ranger from Buffalo Gap, Texas. Those of you that are wondering where in the world is Buffalo Gap, check a map. And it's a great historical town. And it actually was a gap between two waterways where buffalo would actually herd back when we had buffalo roaming the plains. And that's where it got its name. There's a lot of great history there. So he's from Buffalo Gap, Texas. And they sort of join up by accident, if you will, after a band of outlaws raid a ranch. And they steal a rancher's herd, his horses, and they wound his 19-year-old daughter. And that rancher happens to be a retired U.S. Deputy Marshal. So he survives the original attack. His daughter recovers from her wound, and she's a very strong character. She's not a weak character at all. She actually joins in on the pursuit of these rustlers, outlaws, as they flee up into what is now Oklahoma, but back in 1877, the summer of, when this setting occurs, it was known as the Indian Territory, and the far western panhandle, which at one time was a section of Texas until the Civil War came along and the United States government took it away from Texas, sort of, in a way, and it turned into just no man's land is what it was deemed by a judge, and that name stuck. So there was no real law up there in the Indian Territory, which is why it was really a cesspool of outlaw and basically Old West gangster behavior. There weren't a lot of established towns there. They were more like settlements and encampments and that sort of thing. And that's where these individuals that raid this ranch, that's where they start fleeing to with this herd of cattle and so forth. And the genesis, really, a little bit of history here at this time period, in 1877, the summer of, the state of Texas, Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, stretched out to the east, Arkansas, Louisiana, to the west, New Mexico, southern Colorado, was in about a 4-year drought period. And that drought period, which is historically accurate, that drought period really is the genesis of how and why Gunslingers takes place. What was happening is because there was a shortage of water because of the drought, there was a shortage of grass and feed for the cattle, and also obviously the water holes were drying up. So a lot of cattle were dying. So the bigger ranches, the bigger outfits, and the cattle industry had been established by then for sure, but it wasn't what it was going to become a few years later. It really got big later, and I'll have a diagram of some cattle drive trails here in a moment for you. But this was, again, this was earlier in the cattle barren world, if you will, in '77. So what started to happen is some of the nefarious cattle ranchers or their workers, the cowboys that worked with them and so forth, their trail bosses and such that weren't completely honest, what they would do is they would then raid some of the small to mid-sized ranches, and they would take that cattle that they would rustle and they'd integrate it in with the big herd, and it would get lost in the shuffle and so forth. There wasn't tracking or anything like that back then so much outside of branding, which branding could be changed. But a lot of these nefarious individuals, they didn't even bother with changing branding. They just integrated the stolen cattle in with the herd that had been decimated by the drought, and then they started running them north up into Kansas, where the railheads were just starting to extend to. Again, in '77, rail hadn't come that far west yet. The railroads were working on it pretty heavily at that time. So that's really the genesis of gunslingers. The outlaws, why they attack, raid this ranch, the nefarious trail boss and so forth, they go to take this cattle, and initially their idea is that they're going to integrate it with a larger cattle herd, but things change down the line. And that creates some of the conflict that we have in gunslingers. This is a map, as you can see, Texas in 1877, and there's a little bit of it's kind of hard to see, I know, a little bit, but it gives you an idea of the shape and basically, and what we're talking about here in Gunslingers is up in the North Panhandle, up around present-day Amarillo, which in 1877 was actually called Oneida. The Indians, the natives, had named the settlement Oneida, and it was still considered and called Oneida back in 1877. So in the book, when you're reading about Oneida being the big town, it's actually present-day Amarillo. And everything takes place a little bit north of present-day Amarillo. So that's where we're at up there. So you can see where the town that gets attacked, the ranch that gets attacked, is right up there along that no man's land, that panhandle of the Indian Territory border. So it was very, very easy for cattle rustlers and outlaws to come into Texas and create havoc, do their dirty deeds, and then flee up into the territory, because it really was very close, even on horseback. Red River Reunion, Book 2, also takes place up in North Texas, which is where I kind of focus this series on, at least for the first couple of books. But Red River Reunion takes place a little bit further east, and I'll get into that here in a moment. Now this here is the cattle drive map that I told you about, and this, I think it shows there the Goodnight Loving Trail. Very, very popular trail. This map here depicts it as it was, no question, but it wasn't as established like this in 1877 when Gunslingers is taking place. Charles Goodnight came along right around that time, along with a couple of gentlemen from Great Britain, of all places, and they started another big ranch called the J.A. Ranch at that time up here in North Texas and so forth. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of the cattle trails that were going from the south up through the north, and the red lines you see up there are the railroads, and you can see how far the railroads had gotten. And this map is actually it shows the railroads a little bit more established than what they were in the time period of Gunslingers and Red River Reunion. moving forward. Book 2, Red River Reunion. I didn't know it at the time, but this title has caught more people's attention than I could have ever dreamt. I thought it was a good, solid title. I can't tell you that I agonized over the title of this book for weeks and months and so forth. I know that some authors will do that. This just kind of was a natural title for me. And like I say, it has caught more eyes. When that book is sitting on my table, when I'm making an appearance and I have people walking by and so forth, it really does catch their attention, much more than the Gunslingers book does, despite the bright yellow background on Gunslingers and so forth. By the way, just one comment on Gunslingers. I agonized a little bit more about the title of Book 1 than I did on Book 2, which probably isn't uncommon for an author that's just creating their debut novel, because you want to try and make things as perfect as you can. Certainly I did. And then, once you start and you write Book 2 and then you move on to Book 3 and then you look back and you realize that now it really, it's very difficult to try and do something perfect. It's really impossible. But Red River Reunion, the reunion part of it, basically is, again, part of the elevator speech that I spoke of earlier. Luxton Danner, the U.S. Deputy Marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, gets dispatched by Washington, D.C., to go to a town called Range. There were several towns along the Texas side of the Red River that were constantly being raided by outlaws that would cross over the Red River from the Indian Territory, raid the settlements because that's where the money and the goods and the people were. Then they would flee back over the river back into the territory, again, because it was a safe haven for the outlaws of the day. Now, this book takes place just a few months after Gunslingers. This is the fall of 1877. And at the same time that Luxton Danner, the deputy marshal, gets dispatched by the actual Western District Marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, he's actually on a more or less a reconnaissance mission. He's supposed to go gather intelligence and then report back to find out what's actually happening in that part of Texas. And they only send one marshal because at the time, the marshal's office was incredibly thin on manpower, and so many of the marshals were up in the territory already pursuing outlaws that had warrants out for their arrest. So the marshals really didn't have that much latitude. They didn't have the opportunity really to go check out some of these areas. But the leader of a community of the town called Range, which is a fictitious town on the Texas side of the Red River, sends a letter to Washington, and the president actually places the order to go down and find out what's going on. The same community leader sends a letter to Governor Hubbard of Texas and is requesting Texas Ranger assistance. Because at that time, other than hiring your own town marshal, really there weren't a lot of county sheriffs yet. A lot of the counties had been established, but they were in their infancy. And there wasn't tax money generating yet. There wasn't a great deal of wealth in a lot of the Texas counties. So a lot of them didn't even have a county sheriff yet. Some did. But the towns were really, it was up to the individual towns to have their law right there local. They'd have to hire somebody, and oftentimes they would hire a well-meaning man in the town who was okay with a gun and felt that he could defend himself and so forth, but oftentimes it didn't end very well for those individuals, like you see depicted in films and in television shows. Some of that, yes, is fiction for entertainment, but a lot of it is actually true. So the governor of Texas, Governor Hubbard, he sends one Texas Ranger, and no, the idea wasn't that there's one riot, one Ranger at this point. It was, they only had one Ranger really to send. Many, if not most, of the Texas Rangers that were still employed at that time by the state were being dispatched down further south. If you look at the map here, I can go back. They were being dispatched further south down along the Rio Grande because the Mexican government was starting to create some new havoc along the southern border of the state. And the President of the United States was concerned that Mexico might try and start another war with the United States through Texas. And he didn't want that to happen. So some of the cavalry, there were forts that were established along that southern border at the time, and there were cavalry units that were being dispatched, but the governor wanted to make sure that Texas had a presence there. So a lot of the Rangers were actually being sent further south. So get back to that. So that's why one Ranger gets sent. Well, unbeknownst to each other, these two primary characters, they take off from Buffalo Gap, West Payne, from Fort Smith, Luxton Danner, and they converge on this town, hoping that the other is the one who's been selected because they had already worked together successfully and had formed a bond and a friendship from the experiences they had in Gunslingers. So as it turns out, it is the two same characters, and then they embark on defending and helping the local community prepare themselves to defend against these constant outlaw raids, which all this is historically factual. At the time, these towns and settlements, really settlements, they were barely towns, had been established along the Texas side of the Red River, and many of them were from the Deep South. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, a lot of the southern folks down there, they didn't care for Reconstruction much, so they loaded up everything they had and they started west. Well, a lot of them made it to pretty much the central part of Texas, up in the Panhandle. They made it a little bit further. Some of them made a little further, and that's where they ran out of medicine. They ran out of supplies, money. So they thought, well, this land looks pretty good here. So we'll just stay right here. And they followed the Red River for a number of reasons. Now, the Red River, very shallow. It really didn't have any maritime, transports going up and down it. It had some in some places, but particularly during the drought years, you can imagine that with the lack of rain and such, the river was even more shallow, which is why it was so easy to cross from the territory on the north and come over to the southern side and raid and pillage those Texas towns and settlements along there. So that's pretty much the genesis of Red River Reunion. Again, it's driven somewhat by the conditions that this part of the country was experiencing at that time, but more so, it really has to do with the efforts of the two primary characters helping the town folks sort of rally around each other and try and ward off some of these outlaws. And there's a couple of twists and turns in there for those fans, those readers who enjoy the little bit of mystery and some surprising moments. I think you'll be satisfied with that. And one last note that I have is that I started out thinking that Luxton Danner, and as I told you earlier in the presentation, Wes Payne, who I did not foresee existing in Gunslingers, let alone subsequent books. He's now a primary character. I thought that my goal was to write one book, but when I got to the end of Gunslingers, I knew that I had a second book in me, and I just kept on going. And then I decided, well, I like the trilogy idea, so this was going to be a trilogy. So I wrote Red River Reunion with the thought process that I would segue into a third book, which has happened. And I have to be careful sometimes when people ask me questions, because I'll start to answer and then I'll realize, oh no, wait a minute, that's information that is contained in book 3, and I don't want to quite give that information out yet. But it's now turned into a series, And I think Tom and I will talk a little bit more about this here, but I found myself having so many storylines and so many other characters that have come to me that I hope to just keep writing the stories, and as long as I keep getting positive feedback to the degree that I've received on these first 2 books, I'll keep writing, and I hope that everybody continues to enjoy them. Tom, that's pretty much the end of the presentation for the first 2 books, so we can move on from there.
How did your career as a police officer, your knowledge of firearms, your knowledge of I am sure that many of the people who you were apprehending in your life lied about where they were or the crimes they committed. How did all that prepare you for your novels that you've written?
Well, the characters, the 2 primary characters in my books, I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that they would be connected to law enforcement in that era that they were. The fact that one is a deputy marshal and the other is a Texas Ranger really wasn't predetermined by me. That just sort of happened, and I liked that. So I thought that would play well. But where my law enforcement career, I think, has assisted me more so in those characters, at least to this point. The characters are developing, of course, as I move along, but it's really the mindset of the outlaws, of the criminal element in the books, because it does come from a number of experiences that I've had with certain individuals in my career dating back 40 years here in the state. It's been somewhat colorful at times, and I've had the opportunity, if that's the right way to put it, to experience a number of things with individuals that did decide they were going to lie and so forth. So I think that helps me with the development of my outlaw characters, at least for these first 2 books.
The outlaws, in all cases, can cover a wide range of different personalities. Of course, the most prevalent is the sociopathic or antisocial disorders. And I'm sure you've experienced much of that in your career. And how did the element of sociopathology, the criminal who thinks they are entitled to somebody else's cows, they're entitled to whatever they want because they want it. How did that, I'm sure you've encountered so much of that in your life, how did that show up in your writing?
Again, it certainly is an influence in the writing. In this particular, in my genre, there is some entitlement for sure in a couple of the nefarious characters that I won't give away. I'm sure the folks that have already read the books, they know the characters that I'm referring to. And for those of you who I hope will read the books in the future, I think you'll see what I mean there. But there are antagonist characters, and then there are villains. And oftentimes people will kind of use the terms interchangeably and such, and really they're different. In a lot of different genres, but particularly in mine. The antagonist is usually at a higher level than the villain, and those villains are the ones who display the behaviors that you're mentioning. The fact that they don't care, they don't have any thought of this belonging to somebody else. They just know that they would benefit greatly from it, and they're tougher, they're faster, they're stronger, They're more organized. There's more of them than there are the good guys and that sort of thing. So there's all these different scenarios that can play out and that do play out in some of the scenes in my books and many other Westerns and other genres too. I mean, we see that in contemporary stories now too, and in real life. So the villains in the stories really display more of that sociopathic behavior that you're referring to.
They're entitled to whatever they want, and they don't care of the consequences of their behaviors.
Correct.
What were some of the challenges you had in character development in your novels?
Depending upon the character, I wanted to have in all of my books thus far, I wanted to have a strong female character. So that took me more research and more conversation, really, with strong women that I know and so forth. And I've had the opportunity to work beside a lot of strong women in law enforcement over the years, and other areas too, but directly with a lot of strong women in my other profession. So I was able to draw on some of that experience, but that was a challenge for me. Also, a challenge for me is having I'm not going to say romantic connections between the characters, but there's some attraction, of course, between some of my characters because they experience life and death together. They're together on the trail and so forth. So they're drawn together, and that is a challenge for me that hopefully I'm getting better at as I move along in my books.
One of the observations that I made about your novels, I'll give a little backstory here. I have worked with bookstores before, and when I've asked people who were been in the book business much longer than I have, what sells books, and they would say violence. And so for just to give an example, in a Civil War diary about how they came across a lake and had to cross it, nobody's interested in. They do want to hear about who was shot, how they were shot, and what it looked like afterwards. Those books sell. Those were the examples he gave me. And I noticed in your books that there's violence, but it's low key, and it's not gory. And can you comment on that?
Certainly, that's by design. I patterned some of my writing, and I mentioned earlier in my presentation that Louis L'Amour was and remains an influence on me, and I don't know how anyone in the historical Western genre couldn't be influenced by L'Amour to some degree anyway, whether it's positive, negative, and so forth. It was always positive for me. I always felt that when I was reading a L'Amour book, I was there. I was part of the show. I was part of the action, and I wanted to bring that also, and all writers do. There's the old adage, show, don't tell. Show the reader what you are talking about. Just don't talk about it. And I understand that, and I work very hard at trying to paint the picture for my reader. But L'Amour one time he had a very famous quote, and there's a video clip of him actually making the statement that he said that if he had to write graphically, if he had to use graphic language, if he had to use graphic descriptions, then he didn't feel he was a good enough writer. And I'm not comparing myself to Louis L'Amour by any stretch, but I really that statement really made an impression upon me. And I also felt that by not using over-the-top graphic language and over-the-top graphic descriptions of my battle scenes, if you will, my gunfight scenes. Now they're there. It's not pure vanilla by any stretch, but I try and keep a lasso around that, if you will, because I felt that it would appeal to a greater audience, a broader audience. And the Western genre, as we know, is a niche genre today. Although it's gaining in popularity because of streaming channels and so forth, we're starting to see Western films coming back, contemporary and historical Western shows coming back, which is very thrilling, for somebody like myself in the genre. But I wanted it to appeal to a little bit bigger audience. And this allows younger readers to read it, and I can tell their parents and so forth, this speech, and that has proven a great deal of success in that younger readership, despite the genre. And I also have a large readership of women. I actually have probably half of my sales are women, and it's not. Most of them, especially my direct sales, when they're meeting with me, when I'm doing a appearance or a signing, they tell me, they say, well, this is for me. Especially when I tell them, well, I have strong female characters in both books. I want to have that. And they like to hear that. And then I'll also tell them that, yes, you're going to get your violence, but it's hopefully for that particular person, that reader, it's not over the top.
That's refreshing to hear, that it's appealing to different age groups. If some of your feedback from some of your fans and customers that you've encountered over the years, what seems to be very appealing to them in terms of lessons learned or aphorisms learned or adages that they seem to tell you, and you may not have been trying to imbue that in the book, but that's what they got out of it. Can you give some feedback?
Sure. Initially, the new fans that I'm fortunately accumulating here, and the buyers of my books and that, they're either interested in that historical period. A lot of the men are asking me, is this historically accurate? Because a lot of them, especially the older gentlemen, they'll say, well, I prefer to read nonfiction books, whether it's military, Western, something else. So I assure them that I am historically accurate. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned it in the presentation, but I did 3 years of research for Gunslingers before it ever went to print, because I wanted to do the best I could in making sure that what was happening in that period was
How'd you do your research?
Well, the historical societies, or the state of Texas and the state of Oklahoma, are big friends of mine. I do a lot there. I also gather information from the railroad history, because in addition to actually building the railroads, there's a great deal of other history, other historical events and so forth that took place while those railroads were being built. And then just as I would research one particular scene, or for example, I said that I have a strong female character in each book. I have numerous female characters in the books, of course, because the women of the West were tough as nails. I mean, they really were. They had to be, or they didn't survive. So I actually would look at clothing sites of Western wear from 1870s, and what were the name of the garments, what were the name of the shoes, and that sort of thing. Because I knew some, or at least I thought I knew some from watching film and so forth. And many of the films do depict accurately. Many don't. But I do a lot of the research either in person at a library, such as the University of Texas Arlington Library. I've been up to their historical floor on a couple of occasions and had the opportunity to look through some books and some maps that they have and so forth. It's a fantastic collection there. But the historical societies are really, really valuable for me.
Final question, and this is, you mentioned in your presentation the scarcity of water. Having spent some years in childhood on farms and ranches, water was always a problem in particular July and August. And so, and it got to the point where you almost had to protect your water like you would for keeping people stealing your house or breaking into your house. You had to make sure your water was protected. And that's even in like the 1950s. And there's two questions I want to ask about that. First of all, I know that when the Red River starts going down and flow, you started to see lots of quicksand, where people literally, cows, I've seen many calves get stuck in the mud along the Red River. And then people get stuck and cars get stuck. Of course, there weren't any cars in your novels, but can you tell us about how good people can become change personalities with the scarcity of water? It's almost like in normal times they would be good people, but during the times of scarce water, and cows would go crazy looking for water.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit about the quicksand and also about how it literally changes personalities of not only humans but the cattle?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that defending water was one of the primary reasons for gunplay in a lot of the areas, particularly here in Texas and over in New Mexico too. Water rights were gold, more valuable than gold, even when gold was hit. And so forth. And there were plenty of individuals that fought and died over a well, over a watering hole that would stay wet year-round, because that was very scarce. So really, I had a graphic up there earlier that showed the cattle trails. And the cattle trails basically were designed, thank you, they basically were designed not so much to be a straight shot to where you needed to go up there in Kansas. As you can see, that Goodnight Loving Trail, I mean, it hooks from Fort Concho way to the west. And those trails were basically designed along water paths and it was just trial and error, basically. Some of the early cattle drives never made it. Cowboys died on the trail. So many cows went crazy and died because of that and so forth, that they never really made it to market. So a lot of that trial and error came in, and a lot of bloodshed, not necessarily fighting bloodshed, although there was a lot of Indian fighting early on. In the early days of the cattle industry, but those trails basically were cut, if you will, on two things. They had to have some flat land. They couldn't be running down into Palo Duro Canyon and running a herd of 10,000 head of cattle through there. So they had to go around that and so forth. But they went along those water holes. And there was a lot of that. A lot of the farmers who had a well and so forth, they would utilize that. Some of them actually profited from that. And you see this in some of the films too, where you'll see stagecoach routes, and they stop at a particular location specifically because that farmer had a well, they had a water hole and so forth. They had that water source year-round in that. And the stage lines, the owners of the stage lines, would actually pay them big money for the times. It was big money so that the stage could stop there. So you saw everything in our part of the world anyway really did revolve around that water. Now reference the Red River in particular, and you see this depicted in some films actually too, and some historical programs. The sand, you know, that silt up there definitely acted as quicksand and so forth. And some of those, particularly the bigger cows, you know, they'd sink down in there, and the cowboys couldn't get them out. They absolutely couldn't get them out with their ropes and such. They would end up breaking their neck or killing them anyway. So some of them were left behind. And the crossings, just like the trails that were cut along those water routes, the river crossings were far and in between. So those trails, they would find, you know, the scouts and so forth would find the best crossing place where they weren't going to sink in, you know, and up to their neck, or the cows, you know, certainly beyond their girth and that sort of thing, where they couldn't rescue them. And a lot of that river crossing can be credited to the Native Americans, the Indians, because the Indians, they knew where these crossings were. They knew where to stay away from. And so the cavalry had a number of Indian scouts. You see that depicted everywhere, historical books and in film and so forth, documentaries. And that was absolutely just crucial to this. So the guys who were in charge of running the cattle herd and so forth, you know, the individuals that, you know, were responsible for that point, they often either had an Indian scout with them already, or they knew where to go because of that. And a lot of that came from the cavalry post-Civil War in our part of the country.
Well, John Lane, thank you so much for being here tonight, and best wishes, and look forward to coming back for your next novel.
Thank you very much. Book 3 has already been written, and it'll be released a few months down the line. I'd like to also add in there that Red River Reunion is currently being adapted to a feature film screenplay, so hopefully that will develop, and we'll see that in the near future.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.